Thank you very much. Welcome back, everyone. We have another set of concepts and proposals from the review of the universal standards, which now pertain to recommended revisions to the reporting model. I'm going to send it back to Sarah Jane to talk us through this, please.
Thank you, Judy. Welcome back. So this brings together some things we've been discussing over the past few sessions on Universal as well. So there may be some repetition of things we've discussed before, because ultimately what we are proposing now is what an organisation is expected to report to be in accordance with the GRI standards. So we looked at a few possible ways that we could make revisions to the reporting model. And the first one was to do nothing. The second one was to replace what we call the GRI reference claim with wording that clearly shows the report is not in accordance with the GRI standards. Building on B, we had option C, which was to make some revisions to the existing core and comprehensive. So we retain that model of 2 in accordance reporting options, but we would probably look to make some revisions, and we would have to anyway, given the changes we have proposed for you in terms of 101, 102, and 103. And then the more extreme measure was to change the referenced claim, but also to move to a model where we only have 1 in accordance reporting option. And it is this option D that we, the Standards Division, are proposing to you today. And why do we do that? It simplifies the model to have 1 in accordance option. And distinguishes, I think, between a report that is in accordance and one that is not. And then it allows for some evolution from being what we call GRI reference now, and I'll come on to some research we've done on GRI reference reports that we've seen, to move to the in accordance level. And the key input that I would like from the GSSB is I'll go through the proposed requirements for the new in accordance option, but it's really key that we focus on, well, what does this mean in terms of a report being in accordance? So what is the minimum requirements we feel should be included in a report for it to say it is a GRI standards report? So my first question is, before we go into the detail, are there any comments around moving to 1 in accordance option?
Okay, I'm expecting a few opinions about this issue. First of all, maybe we just sort of talk around this a bit and just make sure that that there's a shared understanding of the background, the rationale, and so forth. Maybe we'll just start taking the pulse of the room. Corley.
Thanks, Judy. And Sarah Jane, I must apologize, but this hasn't really occurred to me before. But I was just wondering now, as you were talking through it, whether you considered a modular kind of in accordance approach. So, I mean, one of the benefits of the GRI standards, as I see them, is that they are modular in the sense that, you know, each of them can kind of stand on their own. Is there merit, and I'm happy to hear what other people have to say, but is there merit in considering an option where you could be in accordance with one portion of the standards, and not, because at the moment a single option means you're in accordance with like the whole set of standards or those that are prescribed. Is there, I'm really just brainstorming out loud, so any thoughts on that?
When we were exploring what it means to be a GRI standards reporter, we had various visuals, and they included things such as, well, if somebody doesn't do a materiality assessment and they jump straight into reporting on certain topics, and they may well be material because of the industry, the geography they're in. So, they're kind of a slam dunk. Yes, we're a heavy carbon emitter, so we should do the emissions topic specific standard and report information along those lines. That we believed is the referenced option. So the portability of different topics, they are there, and we continue to develop them in such a way where if that is a material topic, here are the likely things that will help you explain your performance and the impact that you have in this area. So we did consider it, but we always came back to a lot of what is in 101 is fundamental to being a GRI standards report, because if you haven't gone through that determination of what is material and where your significant impacts are, what are you reporting on in the first place? I leave it there.
I find it hard to answer the question, do I support a single level of in accordance reporting without looking at the reasons for omission, which was a bit further in the presentation. So this is a complex one for me. In principle, I support the simplicity of one in accordance level. And in the documentation for this meeting, it's been pointed out that most other organisations only have one compliance level, in accordance level, so that there's a rationale there. But a key thing is, how much do you need to report on? What are the reasons for omissions that mean you don't have to report on various things? And that's where my concern is about which things you can use reasons for omission on. I suppose if I was to put it overly simply, I'm concerned that the single in accordance level is really fairly close to the current core level, and so we're not actually pushing reporters to report more. I suppose I actually made a note here. Could a company make all the required disclosures, which the reasons for omission are not allowed, including listing their material topics, and then claim reasons for omission to report on none of them at all, none of the material topics? They might list them, but then they say it's commercial, it's commercially confidential, it's the data is incomplete or inadequate. There's the other ones, not a relevant proxy. So they could go through this process of saying, yes, we're in accordance, and year after year just would not actually report on their material topics using the reasons for omission. So that's the sort of scenario I'm concerned about.
Evan.
This one's come up at dinner before. Has this ever happened? Do you have any evidence that there are companies that have used they've taken a very broad interpretation of the reasons for omission and essentially been compliant with the standards by reporting nothing?
I don't think we have seen the extreme. What we have seen is a claim to be comprehensive and then a very elaborate use of the reasons for omissions, also in areas where you then go to the industry and you do a peer comparison. The argument that something is confidential or there are legal limits to what you disclose is not a real one, and so you can question that, I think. But we haven't seen the extreme, but in theory, well, the team can also explain when we go through the next steps that there's more nuance to it, but you can go down that road quite far in saying, well, we're trying to avoid reporting on certain things.
This is more from out of my ignorance, but I was looking at the write-up, and it says 42% want to retain the current reporting model. So, maybe from the have you had a chance to find out why they want to, and before you move to you propose a new model?
From the team's perspective, we feel this is very much positioned with the timing. So a lot of reporters have only just done a GRI standards report for calendar year 2018 in the months that we may have been asking this question. So now we are talking about something that probably wouldn't be required for a few years from where we sit today, as in you have no choice but to adopt this new model. But for them, it feels they have just got over the hurdle of GRI standards. So very much when we delved into it, it was we like to keep things the same, and this was from consultants, but also reporters too.
Okay, I feel like there's a sort of, and you are trying to do that in the way that you structured the questions here, but we need to make sure that we sort of, on the one hand, we talk about the principle of having a single in accordance option, and then we also have to look at the application of that and the sort of the devil in the detail of what does that mean, how does that roll out, and in the real world, what have we seen and what do we anticipate? Gustavo.
Yeah, it's good to say that we have to analyze the impact in each part of the standards. I agree to simplify the use of the standards with only one accordance. Yeah, I'm thinking about the impacts in the different disclosures. The great difference between one criteria and another is first of all in the governance, the disclosures. I am thinking about the new reporters that they feel comfortable to abort gradually the standards. I think that for example, in that part, we can think not that the exhaustive criteria is like the comprehensive criteria is the first. We can think that the core option could be the first one, and the governance disclosures could be like an addition. And for the specific disclosures, well, we can think that the comprehensive should be the first option, and then use the omission options. Thinking about the omissions, I feel that the companies doesn't like too much to put an omission. So for the governance, I think that should be the core, the first option, and then additions. And the specific, okay, I have to report energy, all the energy disclosures. Okay, I have an omission for some disclosures. That what I think that could be an option.
Okay.
Yeah, go ahead.
I think it's, the issue is sort of from the user perspective, because I think users are probably unclear often what the difference is between comprehensive and core. This is actually an effort to kind of simplify things. It may not be that the reporters want to change things, but you have to think about, does the person who's reading the report understand what it is they're actually getting?
Yeah, well, I mean, at the risk of taking this a little bit broader, I mean, I absolutely recognize that, but I would also just kind of want to state for the record that we can, as a standards board, we can set this bar wherever we like. There is not an independent institution that will create the conditions to ensure that this is applied properly by reporters. We can stick anything in any of these standards. If it's a self-declared situation and there isn't any kind of built-in review that is independent and done according to standard processes, well, we have a kind of a toothless sort of scenario here, which until something significant changes about this arrangement, that is just the fact of the matter.
Maybe just to build on that point, I think one thing that we're trying to do and that we discussed in the team here is from a report user perspective, more clarity on what you can expect, also for the engagement that we increasingly see on this type of information. That's currently not aided by having that dual approach with core and comprehensive, and I think that's one other consideration for simplifying it. Just purely the user perspective of when an organization says a GRI, this is a GRI report, I can go into an engagement and say, interesting that you say that because you're not actually doing all these things, right? And we see too little of this right now.
Michel here, may I come in?
Just one further comment. In the U.S., we have a solution for that exact issue because in the U.S., one of our favorite pastimes is suing each other. And so when, whether it's, even if you have audited financial statements, someone's going to argue that what you put in there doesn't agree with the standards and that they were somehow harmed by that. And I've just kind of been waiting now to see for these lawsuits to start to arise out of these sustainability reports where someone says, well, you said that you were reporting on this, but actually it wasn't there. And I made a decision, investment decision, whatever it is, based on you not telling me the truth. That will come for sure. So you're right that there's not really like a regulator in the middle of it, and that would be better if there was. But in the U.S., ultimately, we have some way of kind of dealing with this. It may be a horrible way, or unless you just love lawsuits, which we seem to in the U.S. But so there's some way of dealing with that.
Judy? It's Michel here. May I
So,
come in?
this was my attempt to simply put forward what we in the Standards Division are proposing would make up a in accordance report. So as now for the core and comprehensive, everything within GRI 101 Foundation, including all of the recommended revisions that we've been discussing, would be required. So you would have to go through a determination of your material topics, you would have to comply with the quality principles, and we felt that that the foundation would be required for any standards report.
Sorry, Sarah Jane. I understand Michel is trying to make a comment. Please go ahead, Michel.
Yes, I was not sure you were hearing me. Can you hear me? It seems I'm offline. I will need to reconnect. I don't know if you can hear me. I can hear you.
Now we can, Michel. Please start again if you don't mind.
Okay. I just wanted to give a user perspective here. I'm in favor of having one approach only because every year as a user we struggle with the difference between core and comprehensive, and we are certainly not the only one. We never get question of the external world whether we're core or comprehensive. We get questions, is our report a GRI report or not? It's basic.
Thank you. That's very helpful. Okay, Sarah Jane.
The 102 disclosures that we have been discussing in the session before this, they would be required for all reporting organizations, with reasons for omission permitted for some disclosures, and we'll go into the detail of which disclosures they are shortly. For the management approach, the recommended revisions that were tabled yesterday, we would propose that for each material topic, an organization would have to report all the requirements in the management approach disclosures. However, we would permit reasons for omission for all elements of 103. When it comes to the topic-specific GRI standards, where a material topic is covered by a topic-specific GRI standard, one is expected to comply with the management approach, which we've just alluded to, the general. But if there are any specific management approach disclosures within that topic-specific standard, which is something we are seeing evolving with the more recently revised standards, that would need to be reported, and any appropriate topic-specific disclosures. And there's a very deliberate use of the word appropriate there. And this goes back to a discussion that we had yesterday where, for example, if your impact is in your supply chain, yet the topic-specific disclosures in a GRI standard only talk about your own activities, perhaps there is merit in identifying alternative performance measures. For any material topic not covered by our GRI standard, again, we would recommend reporting other relevant disclosures for that topic. And I should say reasons for omission would be permitted for all of the topic-specific disclosures. And then we come to the claim, but this will be revisited later on when we come to the discussion of a possible management sign-off. But the proposal at the moment is that this report has been prepared in accordance with the GRI standards. Simple statement. So that, in essence, is the minimum required criteria. I don't know whether we want to stop there, or would you like me to go to the 102?
No, let's pause here for a second. Quick clarification on the paragraph around the topic-specific GRI standards. You gave the example of the impact being identified, for example, in the value chain, whereas the topic-specific disclosures do not focus on the value chain. This is a hypothetical. We don't know if this is a real scenario or not. Is that not actually the same scenario as the second half of that? For each material topic not covered by a GRI standard, report other relevant disclosures for that topic.
Possibly, but it could be something such as, I don't know, waste. And your own activities aren't producing the waste, but you're using suppliers who are very wasteful. Then the expectation is that you describe that impact and what you're doing with your suppliers to manage it. Yet the standard might not ask you about waste in your supply chain when it comes to topic-specific disclosures.
Yes, but in that case, you'd be looking for the reporter to report other relevant disclosures for that topic. Is that, yeah, so it's sort of, in a sense, I'm just kind of reading it as a slightly repetitive
Well, I
sort
think,
of
I think the
interpretation.
difference is they would pick up in that specific example the waste standard as it stands, and they would report the management approach portion of it. But then when it comes to the topic specific disclosures, they would find only disclosures focused on their operations, and they would skip those. So I think that's the nuance. But how we set this out later, that's definitely something we can have a look at.
But also this covers topics that are not covered whatsoever by a suite of standards, GRI topic-specific standards.
Understood.
To be sure.
Okay, any clarifying discussion around what's been presented here? Yes, Tony.
I'm interested in the appropriate topic specific disclosure. Could we consider to require reporting organization to describe what or how they implement some process to identify the appropriate topic specific disclosure? For example, linkage with the management approach 103-10203, for example, linkage with their commitment, goal or target for this material topic, or for the purpose of tracking effectiveness.
So sorry, I didn't quite get the question.
I think the question is whether we have considered to link disclosure on why certain things have been deemed appropriate or not back into the management approach, where there is an opportunity to say, well, this is the specific impact, and these are the targets that we're setting, these are the goals that we're trying to set for the organization, and we actually have selected the following performance measures to indicate that, right? And there is a cross-linkage between contents that we're creating there and actually the implications of this model, and I think that's something that could be built out. Let's put it like this, and we could definitely subsume that into now the drafting.
Yeah, that was my understanding. It was the sort of the link between the third and fourth blocks of what's presented here.
Yeah, which I think would be very valid. So you can measure all sorts of things, but are they actually the right things to measure, and what action are you taking to improve performance? Yeah. We will take that one forward.
Right. Do you want to keep going?
So I think we've covered that. We did take the opportunity to look at the reasons for emission based on feedback that we had both in the survey and from what we could see was utilised in reports as well as through stakeholder interviews. There was a concern that not applicable is too easily used, and perhaps we ought to rethink what not applicable really means. Because what's interesting about these reasons for omission, there isn't a lot of guidance about them, that this is as far as they go pretty much in the GRI 101 standard as it exists at the moment. So we looked at that. The other, for me, surprising feedback was as well that in the survey, many were not aware of the reasons for omission. And that perhaps explains some of the confusion. And perhaps when we looked at reports, we just saw missing data, but it hadn't been flagged in any way that it had been omitted, and no reason was given. So the proposal is to remove the not applicable, but in this running theme that we've introduced, really asking organizations to think about what is helpful to disclose in terms of describing and communicating the impacts that they have. So where a disclosure doesn't provide a good proxy, and we go back to that example where the waste is in the supply chain and not your own activities, for instance, then that may be an appropriate reason to not provide the indicators that are in the GRI's topic-specific standard, but they would be encouraged to come up with an alternative proxy instead.
Encouraged or required? I mean, if this is reasons for omission, you know.
Here we have written encouraged, but if you go back to 102.47R, where we ask for them to disclose in the general disclosures, the list of material topics, those that are covered by a topic-specific standard, and appropriate disclosures that help them communicate that, it marries up with that. So we could move it to a requirement if.
Well, I think that there's one, we have to have some kind of carve out for, there are issues that are currently looked at from a transparency perspective where there is no appropriate disclosure.
Yep.
And I think that's the one qualifier I would put in, but indeed we could make a stronger link to, we would like to see performance evidenced always, unless there is actually no disclosure available. And I think we were on the supply chain and waste type of discussion and circular economy discussion, and really to find disclosures that form a good proxy for that dynamic. Well, we've explored that quite far with the experts, and we don't have that right now, right?
Yeah, the reason why I asked the question is essentially that I think I've got our three instructive verbs going around in my head at the moment: the shall, should, and can, and I question whether the language of encouragement is correct for a standard to be framing requirements and deviation from requirements. So I would just sort of. Let's just make sure we're using solid wording here that does the right thing, would be my response. Yeah.
I'm honest when I say that I find the wording quite difficult to understand. So if there's, on a first reading, you kind of really have to unpack it. So if there's any way of stating it more simply. And my question would be, what do you then do if something is not applicable, and you're not allowed to say it's not applicable?
The intent was that having identified your material topics, linking them to topic-specific standards, those that aren't covered by topic-specific standards, thinking about other disclosures that would serve as useful and meaningful to communicate your impact in that area, not applicable, fell away.
I can understand in the topic-specific areas, but in your other more general disclosures, if those are basic requirements and some of them are, I mean, I'm not exactly sure. I'd have to go and look which ones would apply, but say collective bargaining agreements, for example, are not applicable in your environment, but it's a requirement that you disclose on them. There's no reason for omission. I don't know if this is correct, but
And I think this
maybe
comes...
it's just maybe it's just worth looking at whether there are any potential ones that
Yeah.
might still remain.
Yes, we can go and revisit that. The thought was that with the 102, we carefully craft which ones reasons for omission apply to, and they have to work, you're right, with the ones that we are proposing here.
That's exactly
Yeah.
it.
Yeah.
If that works, then that's no problem.
Yeah.
Yes, I agree with Corley that I had to think about that phrase, disclosure is not a proxy for identified significant impact. I understand it, but it took me a little while, and I do wonder how it's going to work in other languages, that it might not come across readily. So I support the intent, but I found the wording not straightforward. The other issue is with information available incomplete. It says describe the specific steps taken to obtain the missing information and the expected time frame. I wonder whether it needs to be stronger than that, in the sense that can a reporter just keep going on indefinitely saying that the information's unavailable? I think they can at the moment, and so they're sort of saying, well, this might be a disclosure in GRI, but I'm not intending to collect the information. And they go on doing that indefinitely, but still are claiming in accordance. With the confidentiality constraints, I looked to see whether we already had guidance on that, but there doesn't seem to be significant guidance on the confidentiality constraint, because I think I've heard someone else here, it might have been Kent or Evan, in a previous meeting, saying that there are problems in this area in terms of the increasing use of commercial in confidence to shelter or not disclose information in various forums, and should we be putting on some constraints on the use of this here? That's basic. That's a similar issue with specific legal prohibitions, but that's more straightforward. But the issue of confidentiality constraints is it's a bit open-ended at the moment in the way reporters can use it.
Well, I don't know if this is what Peter's referring to, but I've made the case before that companies have raised the issue of competitive disadvantage concerns, and disclosing things might put them at a competitive disadvantage as they become more performative on ESG and sustainability. It becomes a differentiator from competitors. So the more they disclose, the more they're basically giving away the way they operate their ship.
I am myself reading these in light of the sort of earlier bit of the discussion around creating one single in accordance model. And to me, I think we need to make sure that these reasons for omission are framed in such, we're not really trying to take people on a reporting journey with this. We're trying to describe compliance, which is binary. And I think we need to sort of be robust about that. Yeah. Any other discussion? I mean, are we able to answer this question here? Does the GSSB agree with the recommended revisions to the 4 reasons for omission? It sounds to me, I mean, I think there's some work to be done on the language, for sure. Am I hearing a reasonable amount of consensus about the sort of what goes behind it? Yeah, Robin, yeah.
Yeah, I think generally, sort of answering your question, is there consensus or not? But if we can also, if we were to agree in principle and then test some of these when we get to the piece that looks at where they apply. So, especially Corley's comment about is the disclosure is not a proxy for the identified significant impact. I mean, clearly that applies to where we've got topic specific standards, but how might that be potentially misused when we're looking at some of the reasons, how reasons for omission might apply to that 10 or more governance disclosures, that whether they're going to stand as they are or whether they're going to be re-examined. What's the potential for that reason for omission to be misused in that sort of context? I think they're the sorts of tests we can apply further down the track.
Yeah, just to be clear, the intent of this revised one about not being a proxy was only intended for topic specific, not for the general disclosures. So the thought was that we need to be very careful in understanding that for the general disclosures where we permit a reason for omission, that the bottom three are the only ones that apply, because they are seen as fundamental contextual information. So these would be your get outs. I think it's useful to, if I may, skip to this slide. And we talked about this yesterday. Laura talked about it in the context of feasibility for SMEs, but we feel it's a bit wider than that. So the second half, what if an organisation does not have, in inverted commas, policies or processes in place? And we feel that if you're asked to describe a policy or a process, and you do not have one, you comply by simply stating you do not have one. And that is not seen to be a reason for omission. That is transparency and complying with the disclosure requirement. So maybe that as well, when we think about some of the 102, and particularly the management approach disclosures as well, where it asks you about effectiveness. Well, you declare that you haven't taken any action to evaluate your effectiveness yet. And that would, again, be compliant.
I do agree with the recommended changes for the most part, but also want to say that probably in the language being more direct and stronger, for example, to identify other disclosures should be required and not encouraged. And similarly, I think in information unavailable, that indefinite option probably should not be remaining. So agree and make those more direct and stronger. But I do like the disclosure is not a proxy. It'd be worth testing some examples, I think, and as we were just hearing, do some that have been reported as not applicable, would they fit in that one easily, or and it makes sense? Yeah. I know I have one in mind that I would like to test against that, so, yeah.
Okay, I think we could probably move on.
So when I was describing the required criteria, we did talk about reasons for omission would be permitted for some of the recommended revisions to the general disclosures in GRI 102, and the Standards Division has arrived with some rationale at those with a tick are where a reason for omission would be permitted. So if you go through by section, all organizations are required to report everything under the organizational profile. So we need to know who they are, the activities they have, which entities they're reporting on, the scope of the report. We have also included in here the information on employees and other workers. So a reason for omission would not be permitted. So every organization would be required to report on that. We have one left in strategy, statement from senior decision maker, and everything within what we have labeled responsible business conduct, reasons for omission would be permitted. So this includes the human rights disclosures that were recommended and we discussed yesterday. This also does include principles and values, mechanisms for advice, and concerns about ethics. Then when we move to the stakeholder engagement section, we only have 2 disclosures in there. One being approach to stakeholder engagement, where we felt that reasons for omission should not be permitted because it's a crucial part of the understanding about how they've determined their topics, their material topics, is their approach to engaging with stakeholders. We would, however, propose to allow reasons for omission for collective bargaining, which we talked about earlier. All of the governance disclosures, we would permit reasons for omission. And then everything in sections 6 and 7, which is very much the mechanics of the reporting, but also the process to determine the material topics, the list of those topics, the standards that are being used, you would not be able to use reasons for omission.
Just to add to this, I think we have headings now here, and that's not necessarily the final setup. So part of it is legacy, part of it is the attempt of the team to now reconfigure this with responsible business content. There's feedback on that. So when we now discuss it, disregard that element of it a bit. And again, it's the last 3 reasons for omission that apply here, right?
Yes.
So when you try to do the complicated thing of the proxy logic applied to these type of that's was intentionally not part of it.
Yeah. Now, on exactly that sort of line of thought, I wanted to go back on my own slide over here to the recommended revisions to the reasons for omission and just sort of look at if we are considering, well, let's just go with the first one, statement from senior decision maker under strategy as it is possible to use reasons for omission. They would be constrained to confidentiality constraints, which is absurd, specific legal prohibitions, which I can't imagine, information unavailable or incomplete, in which case there would be a requirement to describe the specific steps being taken to obtain a statement from a senior decision maker, and that's it. So in that kind of context, why would that even, it just seems like such a sort of implausible scenario that somebody might try to use reasons for omission for something like that. I might then apply the same thinking to the human rights disclosures, because the only reason why it would occur to me that these disclosures should not be included in a report is if it just simply is not applicable. If we're talking again at the topic specific level, that would work, but we've incorporated human rights related disclosures into general disclosures, not topic specific disclosures. And therefore, what's the scenario under which policy commitment to respect human rights, for example, would come up against the allowed reasons for omission that do not include the not applicable one? So I hope everybody's following that. It's a little bit convoluted.
Yeah, no, I do take the point about the statement from senior decision maker. You put it there, but arguably, what would be the reason? So perhaps that is one that we turn to across, because in essence, you're not going to be able to find one of the 3 reasons. The reasoning behind the human rights was legal restrictions. So this is something that came up, that perhaps you're not able to discuss everything that you are aware of for that reason.
Okay, and I can understand that with respect to some of the more specific things around human rights. Policy commitment to respect human rights Are there ever anywhere legal restrictions on reporting a policy commitment to respect human rights? Does that exist?
Yes.
There do. It
Yes,
does. Okay,
there are
right.
countries
I'm glad to
where
be told.
that,
Yes. Okay.
so yeah,
Yeah.
they can.
Yeah.
You
Okay.
cannot put any type of, whether it's any type of speech, if you want to use the from a corporate into the public domain, if you happen to be in that jurisdiction and refer to human rights. That is a real thing in some countries.
Gosh, I mean, I wonder how we encourage transparency about. Yeah, I suppose this is kind of the wider issue.
Well,
Yeah.
I think you can declinate that through, right? I mean, they can probably use other words for the same thing, right? Which they do, obviously, because they have to comply with all kinds of international type of arrangements, whether it's on the UN level or elsewhere. But we're calling out for something very specific, and it's actually the experts that brought that up and say, can we force this in all situations?
Okay.
It is tricky.
Okay. All right. I've got Corley and Jennifer and Robin.
Yeah, so just one example that occurred to me as you were going through these things, information on employees and other workers. I remember when we were assessing companies for the JSE Sustainability Index, we struggled with certain sectors like, real estate investment trust and so on, that are investment vehicles that don't have employees. So, I mean, that is an example of not applicable, or it's impossible for them to report on things that don't apply. I'm not suggesting that they are in the practice of issuing GRI sustainability reports, unlikely, but that's just one example that one might want to think about.
Yeah, just to follow up on the example you were using then, Judy, about the policy commitment to respect human rights. It's still, outside of the reasons for omission, there's still the option that they just say we don't have one. Yeah. Right. And they're still in accordance if they do that. I just wanted to propose, I mean, if there's probably a good rationale for all of the ticks and crosses here, but the statement from the senior decision maker, what would be the risk of making that not subject to a reason for omission?
I think based on the discussion, we could happily reconsider that one. Yeah, because it seems to be a rare example of where you could use one of the reasons for omission as we've revised them and removed the not applicable. Yeah.
Thinking in that we are moving to one criteria, I think that I believe that we are pushing the companies for more transparency. So the point of start should be the corruption. So in that way, the 14 is mandatory in corruption, and also the number 41, and also number 18. So if now we consider two omissions, it's like to make a step back, I think. So I believe that should be the same as core option, and then the push the companies to increase the disclosures, and nothing more.
Okay, I think that's a very good point, Gustavo. And I think maybe now that you mention it, the one on collective bargaining agreements, we have just agreed to sort of go back and do some more work on looking at exactly what that is. Maybe let's not make a decision about whether it's a tick or a cross until we've done that work. Does that seem fair?
Yeah, that was done on the basis it remains as it is.
Right.
And so therefore, potentially the incomplete information could come into play. But if we change it, then we'd need to revisit this for sure.
Okay. I think there's also, our conversation here might be slightly limited around the governance disclosures, because we've got one tick next to 20 different disclosures. In these specific instances, members might challenge that sort of blanket application of reasons for omission. So I think we might need to look at that in a little bit more detail.
Yeah, just so that you are aware, the only one that you can The only one it doesn't apply to, reasons for omission, at the moment is 18, which asks about the highest governing body. We have extended that to include committees as well, because we felt that they go in tandem. So under the core and comprehensive, you can use no reasons for omission. Under the comprehensive, you can use reasons for omission for all of them as it stands at the moment. So we were potentially being more restrictive than the comprehensive if we chose to revisit which ones they apply to.
Okay, that's helpful. We are also potentially scoping more research on the governance disclosures anyway. So I might just say that the same thought applies as to the collective bargaining issue. Yeah. Okay. I mean, I think the answer to the question, does the GSSB agree with the recommendations? In some cases, yes. In some cases, no. In other cases, maybe not. And we need to do a little bit more work. Does that work?
Yeah, I think one other point that I would like to raise is we looked at some GRI reference reports. And we looked at 46, 35 of them had a content index, and in that content index, there are a lot of disclosures. And as we delved into it, they were being honest. I think some of them were arguably similar to those that declare themselves to be core. So when we looked at the 102, they had reported most of them. So another thing I think to bear in mind is if you had a fully compliant report and the only thing that potentially was missing was 102.14R or 102.41R, would that be enough for it to not now be an in accordance report?
Sure, you can ask that, but I mean, what would be the problem with a reporter going ahead and just ticking the box, complying with it? It's sort of, at some point we have to decide this is a standard or it's not a standard, and that simply be my approach to that question. If a report is otherwise completely in accordance with the GRI standards, apart from a lack of a statement from a senior decision maker, I would say, please, why don't you just go back and get a statement from a senior decision maker, and then you can make the claim. It's and I might say that about any of these tick marks, except in the case where there actually is a sort of, a potential legal constraint or a genuine difficulty around amalgamating information across operations or something like that, where you can really make a solid claim. If it's otherwise just a kind of, we don't have it, can't we just call ourselves GRI anyway? I mean, you kind of have to say that's not how a standard works, really.
And I think just to add to that, I think we will explore a bit that tangent with the no response, because that could actually go a long way, in particular in relation to the feedback that we had, that in certain jurisdictions you cannot put certain terms up in the public domain. That's just not possible. Then there are workarounds, and one part of the workaround is actually full transparency, say we don't do this. Right, which is the right level of information. All people who are in an informed discussion, they know why this particular organization cannot put out this information, and in an engagement there can be background conversation, and probably that would still be in accordance reporting, because we're not saying you have to have a policy commitment. We're saying, do you have one? And if the answer is no, that is in accordance reporting.
Yeah, and I would agree that in the case where certain content is prohibited by law from being discussed in the public domain, and there are workarounds and there are substitute terminologies that are used in those circumstances, I would still be inclined to say that actually meets the expectation of this. But of course, we don't have, there aren't independent people who will go and certify as to that reality. We just have to create a situation where it is robust and able to be demonstrated by reporters how they have responded to these things, and we need to ensure the understandability of all of this. But I think it's going to be some time before we see the ticks building up across the reporting universe, if I can put it that way. But anyway, have we? I think we may have come to the end of this one.
Okay. Put the question up. One of the things that we started to discuss within the standards division was this accountability, responsibility for what an organization is putting in its sustainability reporting. And I understand this has been discussed previously, but now seemed like a good opportunity to raise it, and we can investigate it or not. But we in the Standards Division would really welcome a steer from the GSSB as to whether this is worthy of reopening. So the reasons for suggesting a management sign-off statement and what that looks like, we would need to explore, whether it is a statement from a senior personnel, senior management to say that this report is in accordance with the GRI standards, or it goes further to talk about the fact that the disclosures represent reality, what has happened. We can explore that. But the reasons for investigating it were, would it lead to improved quality of reporting if this accountability is required to be included in the report? We do know that there is increasing scrutiny of non-financial reporting, and some of you have raised that even today. And finally, we felt that it signaled involvement of senior management, so it isn't seen as a marketing PR exercise. It is actually representing something that the organization is deliberately doing, measuring, acting upon when it comes to their impacts on sustainable development.
Okay, discussion of this proposal. Corley.
Yes, I'm in favour of a management sign-off, but of the content of the report, and not necessarily of it being in accordance with GRI, because that kind of implies that whoever issues the statement has gone through all of the checks and balances to make sure that it is in accordance. So for me, it's more about the general principle of having reviewed the content and that it's fair reflection and all of those nice things. But I understand that it's a more controversial conversation than one might realize on the face of it.
Yes, I would like to see progress in this area. It was a significant item of discussion in the G4 where it was proposed but ultimately didn't happen. I can see that with respect to sustainability reporting in particular and impacts and things outside the borders of the enterprise, it is harder for management to sign off. But I think we should be able to come up with a proposal which can deal with that issue, that some things they can say are definitely true and other things they think are true but can't guarantee it. There is an issue about whether, in this field, I think, about whether businesses that are doing sustainability reports genuinely think they are accountable for what's in the report. I know, at least in the Australian jurisdiction, Robin might correct me about what's going on more recently, but it has been an issue that boards of directors actually felt that they were not responsible for the sustainability report. It was put out by the company, it is on their website, but the board of directors doesn't regard themselves as being responsible for it in any way. So that does devalue the reports. And that if it means basically the user is not entitled to rely on them because the company itself doesn't consider itself responsible for its report. So I do think we need to improve here, and we should be able to make some progress about a management sign-off, whilst acknowledging that because of the nature of sustainability reporting and impacts beyond the borders of the company, that there'll need to be some qualifications, is that the correct word, around this?
Is it Gustavo, please?
I think it's a very good something to incorporate, to include. And regarding that, I think that it should be with the disclosure number 14, and so why it couldn't be omitted, that disclosure. And I think that in many reports, sometimes the statement of the CEO, the president, is the only thing that the users read about the reports, or the first part. So I think that this part could be added in somehow with that disclosure, and in the that you put about the claim here, it could be in somehow the three things could be together, and really important part of the report.
Yeah, perhaps I come from a corporate perspective. I can't imagine what the senior management cannot or shouldn't be responsible for the report. And I'm not quite sure what exactly means by sign off. That doesn't mean it's like an endorsement or physical signature, or cannot be a collective, like a committee responsible for that. So I'm just not sure, what exactly it is.
I also have that sort of reservation around this as well, especially if we're talking about, as Corley proposed, not talking so much about whether or not this is signing off as to this being in accordance with the GRI standards, but as to the content of the reports. I mean, especially, there are some things that are estimated in reports. There are some things that, the chief executive cannot possibly be expected to to certify on their own behalf whether or not a certain number is correct when it could be restated 3 or 4 years later. It's sort of, I think it opens up a certain level of just kind of questioning as to what is it that we need sign off for. Although I'm hearing interest in, as to the question put here, should we investigate this further? I think I'm hearing interest in doing so, but there might be different ways to scope this. I've got Robin, Kent, and Evan.
Yeah, I think just for also supporting to not have it be a sign off of being in accordance or not, and entertaining different options for what we mean by sign off, at least in some reasonable form. So you do see some reports that say, whether the sustainability report has been tabled with the board or approved by the board before publication, or some sort of statement like that, rather than a pro forma that we put into the standard somehow and expect specific wording. So there's probably a range of options to entertain there. And I think further to what Peter was implying about directors, especially because a lot of sustainability reports can have those sort of forward-looking statements of strategy and targets. At least in the Australian context, there's concerns about those sort of forward commitments and the extent to which the board's signing off on those achievements.
Evan may be able to speak to this better, but in the U.S., the CEO and the CFO, they sign off on the financial statements, and it has all those issues about potential restatement and use of estimates and so forth. So it's happening out there in the world.
That was not the point I was going to make.
Okay.
I think that you'll find that most CEOs in the U.S. are not willing to put their name on an official in accordance kind of declaration. I think that the model of the UN Global Compact may be useful here, where they sort of require an annual affirmation of support from the chief executive that we are working towards progress on this. We support the idea of transparency and performance, but it doesn't necessarily say, I've verified the numbers in this report, because I just don't think in the U.S. at least, the sustainability report disclosures go through anything like the financial rigorous scrutiny that the financial reports do. And so the CEO doesn't have that same level of confidence that the disclosure is worthy of their signature.
Although maybe it would help if they were required to.
And maybe just to add to this discussion, I think there is a very strong difference between jurisdictions, regions on this. I think from conversations with the European regulators, the assumption right now in Europe is, for example, under the non-financial directive, companies issue this information and they're fully liable for that information and there is no distinction between commercial speech and other interpretations of what that information could be. But maybe part of that investigation that we're proposing actually needs to be to go, because in financial reporting that has happened under the IFRS, that discussion for sure, and there are some other connections that we have where we say we could go back and report back to you how different regulatory perspectives look like. What's pretty clear from the discussion for me is that the shorthand management sign-off is falling short of many things that we're trying to achieve, and we're not going to use that as such. The two elements that we need to explore, one is in relation to, can we include something in such a statement that relates to how the GRI standards have been applied and whether that's in accordance or not. I think these are the questions. The other thing is also an element of ownership that you want to signal, and that is actually coming back in the regulatory discussions that we have, where they're not happy with the claim statements that we currently have. They say, well, that doesn't actually give us a good handle to go back to companies and say, and that's a specific example in relation to the fact that the non-financial directive in the EU has been implemented on nation-state level. The nation-states have said, you are automatically in compliance if you use GRI, and then they start to look at the reports and find claim statements, and they're not quite sure what that actually means. So they have feedback on that, and I think a similar dynamic is happening with stock exchanges and listing requirements, where they say, well, you're auto-complying or you actually have to use GRI, and then they look at, well, who is making a statement around whether GRI has been applied or not, and what does it actually mean. But it's arguably one of the more complicated areas to sort out. So I think the best we can do is we can have a couple of conversations, see how much of this we can play back in the public domain as well, and to formulate these, or to respond back to your question, what's reasonable for a global standard.
Okay, Jennifer, Kent, then I think we probably need to try to wrap this one up because we've got a couple others to get through, and we need to break for lunch very soon. So, Jennifer, go ahead.
I do support further investigation of this in light of trying to remain in a leadership position here. I think the sustainability report is moving outside the realm of the sustainability department, and if we don't address that, as tricky as it is going to potentially be, we'll fall behind on this. So certainly support that.
All right, thank you for that. We covered the second part of this. The first part was merely communicating to you that if they haven't reached the in accordance reporting requirements, that we would propose changing the statement as it exists currently to be more explicit that it has not been prepared in accordance with the standards.
So a kind of practical question around this is, what sort of a decision would lead a company to sort of try to use some part of the GRI standards, not meet it, but then just simply, why would they use the GRI standards in any way, even as a sort of background reference, if what would okay, I'm getting a little confused about this. What would be the mechanism by which you would be able to extract that statement out of a non-GRI reporter?
It's a very good question, and although I say we've looked at a sample of reference reports, I think they set out to be in accordance reports, for sure. Yeah. And that's how they've made their way to our database, because they want to be recognized for having tried, even if they may have failed in a couple of areas, and we're very honest about it. But for me, this would be those more aimed at those users who are taking a couple of topic-specific standards, and we know some of them are encouraged by different regulations, recommended, here go and use our emissions, our water, and that we really want to flag that they have not even attempted to determine material topics, they've just taken a couple of standards and reported accordingly. So this was the intent. But you're right, it does leave those that have tried to go on the journey of doing an in accordance report in a challenging situation.
If we only have a binary in accordance framework, this seems to me to have no relevance, this statement. I mean, Peter.
I suppose the counterpoint to that is reporters can use various ways to claim credit for using a standard without actually saying that they can comply with the standard. So there is an issue about clarifying to what extent they're using the standard. I've seen, not so much with the GRI, but other standards where the companies will say they take a certain standard into account, and they're sort of seeking to claim that they're following that standard, and they're not actually doing so. They're just saying, yes, we read that standard and took it into consideration, but didn't actually say that they applied it. So you want to, that's the issue about trying to avoid that situation where reporters are seeking to get some of the, what's the word, benefit of using the GRI term, but actually aren't doing in accordance.
Well, I was going to say, in U.S. companies, I don't think it's uncommon for them to just comply with certain standards with no intent to have a complete compliance with the GRI. I mean, certain companies like Starbucks, they're only focused on coffee suppliers because that's where the bad press has been, and so they have a very thorough audited report on that one issue, but they don't really have any intent to do a thorough report that complies in every way with GRI, but they may comply with one or two of the standards. I actually, as I say, I think that's probably fairly common in the U.S., where they've just sort of picked out things that they're going to follow GRI and the other things they've decided not to, because they're not there's no regulatory requirement.
Yeah. I mean, I completely accept that happens. I would just question whether or not in that instance the company would make any GRI statement at all, or they wouldn't just sort of, do a report, publish the report, make no if they're not trying to claim in accordance, would they say anything at all about it? That would be my question.
The thing is that these companies, they all tend to have these GRI content indexes, and I'm always real positive about that. For me, in my world, if I was king of the world, I would sort of make the GRI content index your entree into the report, because it's the only way to find anything. And so in some ways, you want to encourage them to do some of these things. I just find it very hard to look at sustainability reports that don't have a GRI content index. I can't seem to find anything.
Yeah, Robin, Gustavo, then maybe words in response, and then we move on. Yeah.
Yeah, I think I'm probably being too generous in view of what Pete just said about how this might be used for organisations to sort of bathe in some reflected glory of using that sort of language of GRI without an intention of moving towards sort of more fulsome reporting. But I'm not sure if my memory serves me correctly by why the referencing claim was originally put in, was when we sort of went to the modular form, and the notion was that the individual topic specific standards could be used as standalones for a variety of disclosures and communications by organisations that weren't necessarily going to do a sort of a full report, but we're looking for some rigour in a disclosure about a topic or an impact where there perhaps aren't other sorts of standards or methodologies available to use in terms of measurement and disclosure. So I'm not sure if we've got to a point of knowing whether that intention has completely failed, or whether, as you're implying, Judy, that there's not necessarily a recognition that that's even a thing by organisations, that the standards could be used in that way, or that this language could be used. But I'd be reluctant to kind of let it go, because it seems that it would still have some potential, particularly for topics where there aren't necessarily other methodologies available, and an organisation has a particular area where it's wanting to do more disclosure or wanting to sort of measure and manage things, and there's no other kid on the block to actually serve that purpose.
I think that this referenced reports is like a shy step to going near to GRI reports, or someone's like Starbucks is like it's not to make complicated report, GRI report, but it's like a reference. I think so. This step is a good one, because the one the start to reporting is like a shy step, and in the next 1-2 years could be a GRI report. This claim is like very complex, and is like a a negative starting about this not prepared GRI report. We can think about the ISO 26000. They have a positive and easy statement about the reference to use the guideline, and we can think in something like that to be a positive, and it also included in the CEO statement is that they have. So I think that's a good to keep it.
Maybe in terms of response, I think to build on what Robin said regarding the reference claim as it stands right now, it was at the time this regulatory dynamic that we were observing that, with the non-financial directive in the EU, with some of the listing requirements, there was only a reference to specific topics. And there was the expectation that actually very many new companies would come to the table, start this type of reporting, being only focused on the implementation of the regulatory requirement. And that's in actual fact what we're seeing in Europe. So when I mentioned earlier in the meeting that very many European companies have now chosen to start to report based on GRI, it's likely, we don't have the details of this, that they are actually in the reference scenario, right? I think a second point to be made, as whether or not you entertain some kind of claim around application of parts of the GRI standards not being in accordance, really also stands and falls how well we can communicate what it means to be in accordance and how much of how solid that claim can be. And I think that discussion that we will have to have around what you can put in the public domain around that, it will arguably be easier with just one model to communicate that and say, if you do this, then you're in accordance. If you use the standards in another way, you have to be public about this. We can say that or choose not to say that. But the solidifying that option is very important. And I think the last point, out of experience and where they are, we have to think very carefully. And I think that's something that we went forth and back on with the team. The intent of a negative statement is to really frame that this is not an in accordance report. From a messaging perspective and also from a perspective that in very many jurisdictions we actually have to fight for the space for our type of disclosure, you might want to recast that in a more positive way and to say it's actually a positive thing that organization, for example, going forward using our tax standard in isolation of any consideration for sustainability reporting. That would be fantastic if more organizations would have comparable information based on the GRI standard. That would serve our institution. It would probably serve our mission. It's not what we intend to do fully fledged, but it's a good step in the right direction. I'll leave it on that. Thanks.
Okay, can you move on, please? I think we've got to get to lunch and all of that. So, thank you. So the next steps, we need to take some time consolidating what it is that we have agreed to, areas where we need to go and do further work. And some of those areas that we look to make further revision, we will come the 21st of November is our next call with the GSSB. So we will have some of it tabled for you then. I am reluctant to say exactly what at this stage without regrouping with Laura and the rest of the team. But in terms of the longer term plan, with what we will table in November and with what you have kindly provided input in yesterday and today, we look to start drafting GRI 101, 102 and 103 in the coming weeks, such that we bring exposure drafts for the 2 December calls. So we set up specifically 2 separate calls because there's a lot of content to get through. And we would look to go for public exposure Q1 next year. And then everything else is subject to change, but with the plan being the end of 2020, looking to approve the final standards. Okay, thank you very much for that, Sarah Jane and Laura and Bastian and everybody that was between yesterday and today, all of the content that has come out of the Human Rights and Universal Standards review, it's been voluminous, and a lot of people have already pored over it in some detail. But as you can see, we have a lot ahead of us with all of this. So thank you very much for all of that. We're going to pause the public meeting. As I previewed earlier, there is a change to the published schedule for the afternoon. We will reconvene the public meeting at 1:30 Amsterdam time with a discussion of the GSSB work program.